Impact investing has a $4 trillion problem. That's the annual funding gap to meet the UN's global development goals. The entire impact investing market, every single dollar, every fund, every ESG label is 1.5 trillion total, not per year. That's total. So we're already coming up short every single year, and the industry is throwing conferences to celebrate its own growth. I've spent decades negotiating multi-million dollar impact deals across Africa, Latin America, and the United States. And what I can tell you is this: the money is moving. The impact largely is not. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly why. 5 structural failures that explain how a $1.5 trillion industry can grow 21% a year while global poverty widens, emissions rise, and affordable housing gets harder to find. And for each failure, I'm going to tell you what actually works. If you've ever sat in a donor meeting where the language was inspiring and the commitment never came, you already know something's wrong. So let's name it. Let's name what's wrong. Problem 1. Most impact investments fund what was already going to happen. Yeah, that's true. Let's start with the most important concept almost no one in this space talks about directly. A Harvard Business School study looked at more than 2,700 impact investors and found that only 12% of their investments could be considered truly additional. The other 88% funded things that would have been happened anyways. And with the impact capital, it would have happened. There's a name for this. It's called the additionality problem, and it's the foundation of everything else we're going to cover today. And here's the simplest way to understand it. If you buy shares in a profitable solar company on the public stock market, you're not giving that company a single extra dollar to invest. You're giving money to whoever sold you those shares. The company's operations didn't change. The impact was already happening. You just got the warm feeling and the label from it. I watched this play out firsthand with a renewable energy fund in East Africa. The deal closed with an anchor capital from the International Finance Corporation and a European Development Finance institution. We celebrated it. It was mobilized impact capital. And 6 months later, I learned that those institutions had already been in conversation and already committed before we ever entered that room. We didn't catalyze that investment. We co-marketed it. That's the truth. The same pattern shows up in U.S. affordable housing today. Nonprofit capital gets credited with unlocking projects that were already funded by Fannie Mae. The press release looks great. The additionality is close to zero in reality. What this means practically is that the industry is measuring the wrong thing. It celebrates deal volume, assets under management, and self-reported outcomes. It rarely asks the one question that actually matters. Would this positive outcome have happened without my money? Before you attach the word impact to any investment, run that test. If the honest answer is probably yes, then call it what it is, a financial investment with a value screen. That's not nothing, but it's not impact investing either. Problem 2, the no trade-off myth is actively blocking real change. The central claim of mainstream impact investing is that there is no trade-off between financial returns and positive impact. You can be rich and save the planet at the same time. That claim is not just incomplete. In many situations, it's actively harmful. And here's why. Capital-seeking market rate returns only flows to where markets already work. And where markets already work, the impact was already happening. And the problem that genuinely needs impact capital, like rural health, infrastructure, prisoner rehabilitation, disability services, severe poverty reduction, indigenous community development, these do not offer market rate returns. They structurally cannot. So if you insist on 10% everywhere, you get the 10% of impact that markets were already going to produce. The hardest problems stay unfunded. That's true. In 2022, impact investing in renewable energy had a record year. They combined effort added 266 gigawatts of clean energy capacity. That sounds enormous until you learn it was exactly enough to power the increase in global energy demand that year. Not 1 terawatt of fossil fuel energy was replaced. The trillions invested didn't even break even against growth. So when I've sat with leaders who are interested in blended finance structures, which I'll get to in a minute, there's a specific moment where the conversation always stalls. It's the moment when I say that impact first capital needs governance rights and lower returns. Commercial investors hear that and they worry about precedent. Nonprofit leaders hear it and worry about power. So both groups resist the recession on both sides. But without it, blended finance is just stacked capital. It doesn't change who gets funded. It doesn't change which communities get served. And it doesn't transform systems where we need it to. It just reorganizes who gets credit. The fix here requires honesty about the trade-off before you structure anything. Hey, this is Gretchen. If you liked what you heard today and you would like to learn more about building resilient financial organizations, you can find more value in the description below by clicking on the Nexus Impact Spotlight. There's lots of information that you can use and actually apply yourself today. If you're willing to accept 5% on a particular slice of your capital, specifically because it goes where 10% seeking capital wouldn't go, then you're doing something real. If you're not willing to do that, you need a different name for what you're actually doing. Problem 3. The measurement system is built to confirm, not to test. 94% of impact investors report that their investments met or exceeded both financial and impact expectations. That number has been consistent for over a full decade. And it tells us almost nothing useful because those are self-reported surveys from investors who chose impact, measuring outcomes they defined themselves. Only 30% of funds use rigorous metrics. 73% of market rate seeking impact investors simply monitor financial performance as a proxy for actual impact. And the logic is, if the company grows, the impact grows with it. That logic conveniently eliminates the burden of measuring actual outcomes. It also eliminates the discipline. There's a group that raised $2 billion and was celebrated as a model of impact investing. It collapsed in fraud. In 2023, Wharton study found that 40% of impact claims are unverified. BlackRock, which was the loudest institutional champion of ESG investing in the world, slashed its support for ESG shareholder resolutions from 47% in 2021 to 4% in 2024. Its CEO publicly abandoned the term ESG and called it weaponized. ESG funds saw nearly $20 billion in net outflows in 2024 alone. The market is losing faith, not because impact investing is wrong, but because the measurement system was built to generate confidence rather than generate evidence. I've seen this pattern across global development work. Nutrition programs get funded because they produce very quick indicators. Governance reform gets sidelined because it's slow and politically complex. Domestically, job placement programs get funded over violence prevention for exactly the same reasons. The metric is easier to count. The timeline is shorter, the story's cleaner, and the root cause goes unaddressed always. What donors say they want is measurable outcomes. What they actually reward is clean dashboards, predictable growth, familiar leadership profiles, and stories that are easy to repeat at a board meeting. That gap is not going to close on its own. The fix is to tie the fund manager incentives to outcome metrics, not financial ones. Not we built 100 solar lamps, but energy poverty in this community fell by a specific verified percentage. Not we placed 200 people into jobs, but what happened to those people 18 months after they were placed into jobs? That requires more infrastructure, more patience, and more willingness to share results that are complicated. But it's the only way measurement becomes a tool for learning rather than a tool for simply marketing. Problem 4. The capital is flowing to the wrong communities. 70% of impact assets under management are in developed markets. The communities that need this capital most are receiving the least of it. Can you imagine? This is not accidental. It's the direct result of optimizing for risk-adjusted returns in environments that investors already understand. Affordable housing funds in the United States frequently end up accelerating gentrification rather than preventing displacement. Microfinance, once celebrated as a breakthrough for financial inclusion, has created debt crises in several markets. Default rates hit 30% in parts of India. Can you imagine? In Kenya, the rapid scale of digital lending platforms led to documented over-indebtedness among borrowers, predominantly women. I worked with a workforce development fund in the United States that placed hundreds of people into jobs. That's right, into jobs. On paper, that's a strong impact outcome. But the underwriting for that fund favored candidates who were already easiest to employ. People with criminal records, disabilities, or unstable housing, they were screened out, not because anyone said that explicitly, but because they were harder to place, and placement was the metric. The fund optimized for metrics, not equity, and the people who most needed the program were the people it was least likely to serve. I think about that all the time because it's not an isolated case. It has actually become the norm. The norm is to structure programs and investments so that they hit their impact targets for the donor, not to solve the root problems facing the communities they claim to serve. Opportunity zones in the United States are a particularly clear example. They've branded as inclusive development. In practice, many of them accelerate gentrification, pricing out long-term residents, funding luxury residential development, and reporting the whole thing as community investment. What genuine additionality looks like in a community is something different. I learned this during my Peace Corps service in a village in Suriname, South America. No roads, no electricity, and no formal systems. Real additionality looks like first loss capital absorbing actual losses. It looks like funding community organizers to build the trust and relationships that make any intervention possible. It looks like building data systems that don't exist yet because the community has never been asked to report on it. It looks like backing entrepreneurs who are high risk and not investment ready by any standard underwriting criteria and staying with them through everything, through all the pivots. That's slow work. It doesn't produce clean dashboards. It requires the investor to be present in a way that's uncomfortable and often very unpredictable. The structure that makes this work at scale is blended finance, where public and philanthropic capital takes the first loss position, absorbing the risk that commercial capital cannot accept and unlocking 10 or 20 times as much private investment in the safer tiers above it. Kawi Safi Ventures did this in East Africa, a $70 million fund combining development institution capital with pension funds, reaching 10 million people with off-grid solar access. Imagine, neither pool of capital could have done it alone. The public capital made the risk acceptable for the pension funds, and the pension funds provided the scale the public capital couldn't reach. That's an architecture that made it work. Problem number 5, the funding gap is so large that the current model cannot close it. The United Nations estimates a $4 trillion annual funding gap to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. That's right, $4 trillion. The entire impact investing market is $1.5 trillion, not in annual deployment, in total assets under management. The math just doesn't work out. And yet the industry continues to celebrate its own growth as though scale of capital labeled impact is the same as scale of actual impact. It's not. This is not a failure of individual investors at all. It's a structural mismatch between the tool, impact investing, and the size of the problem. Impact investing, even done perfectly, cannot fill this gap on its own. It's impossible. Its actual function when it works is to de-risk the frontier, to go first into places where commercial capital will not go, absorb the learning and the early losses, and make it safe enough for the much larger pools of capital behind it to follow. Pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, governments, all of those are the pools with the scale to matter at the level of the Sustainable Development Goals. Impact investors are not the solution, but they are the scouts. They are the ones in first. The most powerful thing an impact investor can do is take the first loss position that unlocks 10 times as much from the investors who come after them. I've negotiated deals across USG funds, US family foundations, and corporate partners. And across all of those conversations, what moved decisions was almost never the impact story alone. What moved decisions was simply reassurance. Reassurance that the investment would not blow up politically. Reassurance that the leadership was credible. And reassurance that there were safeguards if things went south. So in other words, donors are not funding impact. They are actually funding confidence. The pitch shift that consistently moved deals faster than anything else was replacing the impact narrative with the counterfactual. Instead of describing the positive outcomes of funding, I started naming what would break without it, which clinics wouldn't open, which tenants would not be placed, right? Or which tenants would be displaced, which farmers would lose their markets. Urgency beats elegance every single time. When you frame the decision as a specific concrete loss that will happen if nothing changes, rather than an aspirational outcome that might occur if everything goes well, the conversation moves from, okay, I'm interested to, I'm committed. I can't let that happen. Now, what to do with all of this information about impact investing? Where does this leave us? The impact investing industry is not failing because the idea is wrong. It's failing because it has systematically avoided the only thing that creates real additional impact, going where commercial capital won't. The investor who accepts 5% instead of 10% on a loan to an actual rural cooperative that no bank would touch is doing more genuine impact work than 100 green ETFs combined. The fund manager who ties her incentive structure to verify community outcomes rather than portfolio growth is building something that can be trusted. The fundraiser who stops pitching aspirational impact and starts naming concrete counterfactuals is going to close more deals. None of that requires the industry to collapse. It requires honesty about what the trade-off actually is and a deliberate choice to pay the cost of doing something real. That's what transforms impact investing from a label into an actual catalytic lever. If you're working inside an organization right now trying to bring this kind of thinking into how your leadership talks about funding strategy, the next thing to understand is how to build the internal case for it. How do you make the argument for a different approach when your board is still asking about ESG alignment and your donors are still asking for a very clean dashboard? That's what we're going to cover next.